Hello everyone and welcome to our latest maths lesson. We are looking at continuing our work on dividing today. So we are looking at dividing numbers by 10, 100 and 1000. So continuing to use very similar methods to what we've been using this week so far. Once again, place value is are our words of the day. So hopefully you can remind yourself as to why they might be so important that we need to remember them and use them throughout our maths lesson today. To warm up, we are going to think about this question here. So how many different questions can you think of where 42 is the answer? So you might start with something like 1 times 42 if you wanted to try something simple, and then ramp it up to try and use maybe some multiplication, some division, some addition and some subtraction. So how many questions can you think of? Give yourself 2 or 3 minutes, pause the video and see what you can come up with. Okay, let's have a look at a few different ways that I reached the target number. So I started off nice and simple. I thought, I know that 1 is a factor of 42, so 1 times 42. I've got a really simple one in there quickly. I know my 7 times tables. I know that 7 times 6 is 42. I know that I could times 42 by 3 and get 126. Because 40 times 3 is 120 and 2 times 3 is 6. If I add them together, I get 126. So 126 divided by 3 is 42. We've been working on dividing by 10 and 100. So I thought I'd put a dividing by 1000 in there. And I know that 42 times 1000, everything would move over 3 place value columns to the left and become 42,000. So 42,000 divided by 1000. The answer would be 42. And finally, I thought I'd get some decimals in there, because I know if I had this in the ones column, my decimals there, and this in the tenths column, if I'm timesing by 10, we remember that everything shifts over 1 to the left, so my decimal point would still be there. 2 would move to the ones column, and my 4 would move to the tens column. So 4.2 times 10 is 42. Let's get rid of those. Okay, so we're going to work on our estimation skills again. And our question here is, how tall is Mr. Kraft? So we need to think about, once again, what do we know already? So we know that Mrs. Nguyen is either 5'4", if you're using imperial measures, or 1.63 meters if you are using metric measures. So how can you use that to tell you how tall Mr. Kraft is? So like we did last time, try and think of a height that she definitely isn't. So I could say, that he definitely isn't. I could say that he can't be 5'4", because he's clearly not the same height as Mrs. Nguyen. I could say that he's clearly not 3'2", because he's taller than her. You can see that very clearly. So what height is he definitely not? And then have a think about what height you think he is. So just pause the video, have a listen, think about that for a minute or so, and then start the video again when you're ready to find out how tall he is and how close your estimate is. Okay, so let's have a look at how tall Mr. Kraft is and how close you were. So Mr. Kraft is 1.85 meters. That's a metric measure, or 6'1". So he's a little bit smaller than Mr. Stadell was, who was 6'4". But he is taller, not quite a foot taller, but 9 inches taller than Mrs. Nguyen. So if you were really close to that, well done for using what you know already to help you estimate an answer. Okay, so before we move on to dividing by 10, 100 and 1000, we're just going to remind ourselves of what we did in our last couple of lessons. So just remind yourself, how many place value columns does it move and in which direction if you divide a number by 10 And the same question again, but for if you divide it by 100. So for the first one, if we look at dividing by 10, let's look at the number 330. We know that if you divide it, then it moves to the right. Because, for example, if I divide 10 by 10, I know the answer is 1 because there's 10 lots of 1 in 10. So if I divide it by 10, it moves 1 to the right. So my digits need to move 1 to the right. So my 3 in the hundreds is going to move over here. My 3 in the tens is going to move over here. And then I don't need to show that I've got a 0 in the tenths and the hundreds column because we'd go on forever if we did that after the decimal point. So my answer for here is going to be 33 if I divide it by 10. So it moves 1 to the right if you divide it by 10. Then if we, let me see if I can do this, divide it by 100. So let's look at 4,300. Divide that by 100. If we think about simply, first of all, if we have the number 100 and we divide it by 100, we know that's 1 because 1 times 100 is, 1 divided by 1. 1 times 100, getting myself a little twist here, 1 times 100 is 100. So 100 divided by 1, 100 is 1. So we're moving not 1 but 2 to the right if you're dividing by 100. So let's have a look what happens with these digits. If I'm dividing by 100 here, I know I need to move 2 to the right. So my 4 is going to end up in my tens column. My 3 is going to end up in my ones column. These zeros to represent I've got nothing in there. I'm going to move over to the tenths and the hundreds, but I don't need to show them because they're going to be zeros forever. I've got my decimal point. So I just need to know that the answer here would be 43. So if you divide by 100, you move 2 to the right. So if you remember that, that will really help with today's lesson. And before we move on, maybe you just have a little think to yourself, how many times over do you think it is going to move if you divide by 1,000? Remember, if you times by 1,000, it moves 3 to the left. So how many is going to move in which direction if you're dividing by 1,000? Okay, so we're going to do our quick fire questions to start with. So have a look at these 4 questions, see what you think the answer is. Just pause the video, a couple of minutes, write down what you think the answers are for these 4 questions, and then start the video again to see if you're correct. So the first question is, what divided by 10 is 55? So I can work backwards here to work out this. So if I'm working backwards, I can do 55 times 10 to get this answer. So we should get 550. So 550, if you divide that by 10, the digits move 1 to the right in our place value columns, and we end up with 55. The second question is, what divided by 100 is 55? Once again, I can use the inverse here. I could do 55 times 100 to work backwards. So if I do 55 times 100, I know that everything's going to move 2 to the left, and I'm going to get 5,500. And 5,500 divided by 100 is 55 because you move 2 to the right. My 5 in the thousands would move to the tens. My 5 in the hundreds would move to the ones, and I would get 55. My next question is 855,000 divided by what is 8,550? So we could have a look at the 8 here because that's the only unique digit. Here it's in the hundred thousands column, but here it's only in the thousands column. So how many columns has it moved over, which will tell me how many times I've divided it. So if we go from 100,000s, the next column over is the 10,000s, so that's 1 to the right, that's been divided by 10, and then we need to get to the thousands, so that's 2 to the right. So I know if it's moved 2 to the right, it has been divided by 100. And then here, just a quick one, the inverse, so the opposite of multiplying by 10 is, what's the inverse of multiplying? Just tell yourself quickly, It is indeed dividing. So well done if you got all of those correct. Maybe just have a little pause if you didn't get them correct and have a think about how you could do it differently. Okay, so we're going to move on to today's lesson, which is bringing together all the skills we've been working on for the last 2 days and beyond that, really, because the multiplication by 10, 100 and 1,000 is really going to help us with this because it's just the inverse. It's just doing it backwards. So we have a number here, 4 in the 10,000s, 7 in the thousands, zeros in the rest. So that's, tell yourself what that number is. It is 47,000. Our question is 47,000 divided by 10. So see if you can think. If you're dividing it by 10, we remember we move everything to the right once. It's 4,700. So we're just going to show you how that moves down. So divide it by 10, 4,700. If we divide 47,000 by 100, what do you think the answer is going to be? So if you're dividing by 100, you're moving 2 to the right. So what do you think the answer is going to be? Tell yourself. 470. So let's have a look at that in place value column. So if we look at our starting number, which is at the top, 47,000, you can see that this 4 has moved over 1, 2 to the hundreds. 7 has moved over 1, 2 to the 10. So dividing by 100, everything moves right twice. If we divide 47,000 by 1,000, how many columns is it going to move over to the right? Just tell yourself and then see if you can work out what the answer is. So use this number here. How many columns is it going to move over? What would the answer be? So we know that it's going to move over 3 columns, because if you had the number 1,000 and you divided it by 1,000, it's going to be 1, because there's 1,000 ones in 1,000, so it moves over 1, 2, 3 columns. So our answer is 47. So let's just visualize that. So we've got a 4 up here, which is from our starting number, 47,000. And it moves over 1, 2, 3 to the 10s. Our 7 is going to move over 1, 2, 3 to the 1s. 0, so just going to go, because we don't need to represent them after the decimal point, so you don't need to worry about those. So the answer is 47. Right, let's move on. Okay, let's just have a quick think about what stays the same and what changes. So what digits stay the same throughout and what changes. So have a pause, have a think about that. Okay, so what stays the same are these 2 digits, 4 and a 7, you've always got them. But what changes is that they change their place value columns. So that the value of those digits changes when you're dividing by different amounts. So let's just a quick recap. So you have to fill in the blanks here. So I'm going to give you, let's say 30 seconds. If you need a bit more, of course, you can take that time. Or if you don't need that much time, you can just quickly click to start again once you have got the answers. So just answer those 3 questions. So dividing by a number by 10, each digit moves how many to the right? Dividing by 100 moves how many to the right on a place value grid, and then divided by 1,000, how many to the right on a place value grid. So I'm just going to pause very briefly, and you do the same and answer those questions. So if you divide by 10, each digit moves 1 to the right in the place value grid. If you divide by 100, it moves twice to the right. If you divide by 1,000, it moves thrice, or 3 times to the right. So this is just to highlight how many zeros are in there, and you might make a link to that and how many you move to the right. Okay, so we've got a chart here. So we've got our starting number for 35,000, and then on the bottom line we have a starting number that's been divided by 1,000. So we're going to try and fill in this grid here. So the first thing we've done is we've gone off from our starting number, we've divided it by 10. So we know that's 3,500 because everything moves right to the ones. Right to once if you divide by 10. So if we go back to start number again, so 35,000, what's it going to be if you divide it by 100? How many is it going to move to the right? You might want to rewind the video if you have forgotten. You might not need to. How many to the right does it move if you divide by 1,000? So see if you can fill in those 2 squares there. And then we're going to look at this number here. So this number, the start number, has been divided by 1,000 to get that. So if you're working backwards, what is the inverse of division? So if you've divided by 1,000 to get that, to go backwards, you're going to have to multiply by 1,000. So what is 27 times 1,000? So how many columns do you move to the left if you're timesing by 1,000? So 27 is 1,000th of what number? So let's just have a look. So that is 27, that's 10 times bigger. If you times it by 100, you get 2,700. If you times it by 1,000, you're going to get 27,000. So 27,000 divided by 1,000 is 27. So we can fill that in. Now we have the start number for that row. We can start filling out the rest because it's probably easier to work from the start and follow the instructions up here rather than working from the end. It's a really good idea to get your start number as soon as you can. So we need to do 27,000 divided by 10 and 27,000 divided by 100. So just pause the video and see if you can fill in those blanks. So let's have a look at what we get. So hopefully those are the answers that you got. If not, maybe just have a pause and see where you might have made a couple of mistakes and think about your place value columns and how many you move to the left or the right if you're dividing or timesing. Okay, so our next question is 5,700 divided by 10 divided by 10. So we can do this a number of different ways, or a couple of different ways. So we could do 5,700 divided by 10 first, and then we could divide it by 10. So we know that 5,700 divided by 10 is 570 because these numbers are going to move one place value column to the right. So my thousands go to my hundreds go to my tens, tens to the ones, ones to the tenths. So we get 570, and then we need to divide it by 10 after that. So 570 divided by 10, remember you move one place value column to the right if you're divided by 10, so my hundreds are going to go to my tens, and go to my ones. We're going to get 57. Okay, we're going to look at that again and think, how else might we divide that and work it out? So we've got divided by 10, divided by 10. If we had times by 10, that would be the same as timesing by 100. So if you've got divide by 10 and then divide by 10 again, it's the same as dividing by 100. Because if you divide by 10, it moves one column to the right. And then if you divide by 10 again, it moves another column to the right. And we know that if you divide by 100, it moves not one, but two columns to the right. And we get the answer 57. Okay, so this one, think about how you can approach it. We've got 671,000 divided by 100 and then divided by 10. So how do you want to approach it? Do you want to divide it by 100 and then divide it by 10? Or do you want to work out how many you're dividing it by in total by dividing by 100 and then dividing it by 10 further? So have a pause, think about what approach you want to use and see if you can work out the answer to that question. So hopefully you have come up with the answer 671, because if you divide 671,000 by 100, you're going to move two place value columns to the right and end up with 6,710. And then if you divide it by 10 again, you're going to move over one more place value column to the right and you end up with 671. Whilst you're doing this, if you have a bit of paper, it might be useful for you to just have a place value grid drawn out that you can write your numbers on. So you could make a really basic one if you're just using your thousands, hundreds, tens and ones. Obviously you can put your 10,000s, 100,000s in, etc. if you want to, but you can have a really basic one. I'm showing just now that you could draw. So if I've got 6,710 and I'm dividing by 10, I know I move one column to the right if I'm dividing by 10. So my 6 goes there, 7 goes there, and 1 goes there. So having these around are words of the day. Having those nearby, right in front of you, making your notes on them will really help with you answering your questions. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we've got some word problems here. So very, very similar to before. In fact, the same method is just it's a wordy question. So there's words in there. And what we need to remember, we have talked about before, is when there's a word problem, you just need to read it really carefully and understand it before you then try and answer it. So if we read this, the population of Bradford is 530,000. The population of a village close to Bradford is 1/100th the size of Bradford's. So if you pause the video and just decide in your head what you think you need to do, and if you select the key information in there, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so I'm going to select the key information there. So 530,000 is the population of Bradford. And now I know that the population of the village nearby is 1/100th. So that's going to be the key information so far. I knew that was the key information because I knew the question. I should have put the question up first. The question is, what is the population of the village? So the key information there is the population of Bradford and then how that is different compared to the village. So I know that the village is 1/100th the size of Bradford's. So we need to divide it by 100 because by saying it's 1/100th the size, basically you're saying this. That's the village. It's 100. That's the whole at the top. You have to divide it by 100 to get the answer. So can you work out, using what we've learned, what we've talked about, the population of that village? Think about how many columns and in which direction you move if you're dividing by 100. Have a pause, write down your answer, and then restart the video. Okay, so the answer is going to be 5,300 because I'm dividing by 100, and I know if I'm dividing by 100, I'm going to move 2 columns. 2 place value columns to the right, and I'm going to end up with 5,300. Okay, so we have another question. Let's make sure I get to the question this time before we ask about the key information. A supermarket sells £750,000 of goods in a week. The manager of the supermarket earns 1/1000th of what the shop sells. How much does the manager earn each week? So if you just pause the video, underline in your head or write down on a piece of paper the key information from there to work out the answer. So the key information, £750,000 and 1/1000th. So I know that I'm going to have to do 1/1000th of £750,000. So I'm going to have to divide it by 1,000 because 1/1000th of that is the same as saying 750,000 over 1,000, which means 750,000 divided by 1,000. So let me just rub that out. So 750,000 divided by 1,000 is 750 because you know when you divide by 1,000, you move 3 place value columns to the right. So 1, 2, 3. My 7 is going to end up in my hundreds. 1, 2, 3. My 5 is going to end up in my tens. Then I need to represent that I've got no ones by putting a 0 in. So the answer is 750. So that's just a reminder that you can use your place value column. So if I had my 750,000 and I knew that I had to divide it by 1,000, I know that I go 3 place value columns to the right. 1, 2, 3. So my 7 ends up in my hundreds. My thousands. 1, 2, 3 ends up in my tens. And I know I need to put 0 in there because I've got 0, 1. So that's just the same method, just me talking through it again in a slightly different way. Okay, so once again, your activity has been assigned to you on Teams. Thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you soon.